The morning sun was just beginning to warm the peaceful streets of Crystal Lake. The neighborhood was known for its beautiful houses with perfectly kept lawns and gardens. On this Saturday morning in early spring, most people were still sleeping in their comfortable beds. Marcus Thompson walked down Maple Street with his blue delivery bag full of newspapers. He was 15 years old, tall for his age, and wore his school's track team jacket. Every weekend for the past year, he had been delivering newspapers to earn money for college. He knew every house, every dog, and even which porches had loose steps. He enjoyed these quiet morning hours. The only sounds were birds singing and the soft thump of newspapers landing on porches. Marcus was good at his job. He could throw the papers so they landed perfectly by each front door. He was proud that he had never broken a window or hit a flower pot in all his time delivering papers. At house number 247, Marcus checked his list twice. This was a new customer, and he wanted to make sure he got it right. As he walked up the neat stone path to deliver the paper by hand, he didn't notice Mrs. Sun May Park watching him through her window next door. Mrs. Park had moved to Crystal Lake 6 months ago. She was known in the neighborhood for complaining about everything. From the color people painted their mailboxes to the way they trimmed their hedges. She believed she was protecting the neighborhood's standards, but most people just thought she was too concerned with other people's business. When she saw Marcus walking between houses, her eyes narrowed. She didn't know about the new newspaper subscription next door. All she saw was a young black teenager in a jacket walking on private property. Without taking time to observe what Marcus was actually doing, she grabbed her phone and started recording. "This is unacceptable," she muttered to herself, moving closer to her window. "These neighborhoods are going downhill. I'm going to put a stop to this right now." Marcus was just placing the newspaper carefully by the front door when he heard a sharp voice behind him. "What do you think you're doing? Stop right there." He turned around slowly, already knowing what was happening. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned him about being in the neighborhood. He kept his hands where they could be seen, just like his mother had taught him. "Good morning, ma'am," he said politely. "I'm just delivering the newspaper to number 247. He pointed to his delivery bag and the paper he had just put down. Mrs. Park had come out onto her porch, still holding her phone up to record everything. "Don't give me that excuse. I know what's really going on here. This is a private neighborhood. You don't belong here." Marcus took a deep breath, staying calm like his mother had always taught him. "Ma'am, I work for Crystal Lake News. I've been delivering papers here for a year. Would you like to see my ID badge?" But Mrs. Park wasn't listening. She was already dialing the police with her other phone. "Yes, police. There's a suspicious person in my neighborhood. He's on private property, going between houses. He's a young black male wearing a blue jacket. I need someone here immediately." Marcus stood still, his heart beating faster, but his face staying calm. He had been warned about situations like this by both his parents. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "Stay calm, stay respectful, but know your rights." The new customer, hearing voices outside, opened their door. Mr. Young Ho Lee, a kind-faced elderly man, looked confused at the scene on his porch. "Is everything okay?" he asked, looking between Marcus and Mrs. Park. "I just subscribed to the newspaper yesterday." "Mr. Lee, don't be fooled," Mrs. Park called out. "How do you know he's really a newspaper delivery person? He could be casing our houses. I've called the police. They're on their way." Mr. Lee frowned. "Mrs. Park, there's no need for that. I specifically requested newspaper delivery." But Mrs. Park was already speaking rapidly into her phone again. "Yes, he's still here. He's pretending to deliver newspapers. I don't care what excuse he's giving. I know what these people are like." More neighbors were beginning to come out onto their porches, drawn by Mrs. Park's loud voice. Among them was Ji Woo Kang, a young mother who lived across the street. Seeing what was happening, she quietly took out her own phone and began recording. Marcus remained where he was, his newspaper bag still half full. He thought about calling his mother, but decided to wait. She was probably in an important morning meeting at City Hall. He didn't want to disturb her unless things got worse. "Mrs. Park," he tried one more time, "I can show you my work ID. I can also call my supervisor if you'd like to speak with them." "Don't come any closer," Mrs. Park shouted, backing up even though Marcus hadn't moved. "Just stay right there until the police arrive." Mr. Lee had stepped fully onto his porch now. "This is ridiculous," he said firmly. "The young man is doing his job. I specifically asked for porch delivery because of my bad back." Other neighbors were starting to speak up too. "That's Marcus. He's been delivering our paper for months," called out someone from 2 houses down. "He's a good kid, always polite," added another voice. But Mrs. Park wouldn't back down. Her face was getting red, but she kept her phone pointed at Marcus. "You all may be okay with letting just anyone wander around our neighborhood, but I'm not. This is exactly why property values go down. We need to maintain standards." The sound of a police siren in the distance made everyone pause. Marcus felt his stomach tighten, but he stayed still. He reached very slowly into his pocket and pressed the record button on his own phone, just as his parents had advised him to do in situations like this. The police car turned onto Maple Street, its lights flashing but siren now off. Officer Hae-jin Kim stepped out of the car, looking around at the gathered neighbors. He was relatively new to the force, but had a reputation for being fair and level-headed. "What seems to be a problem here?" Officer Kim asked, walking up to the scene. Before Mrs. Park could speak, Mr. Lee stepped forward. "Officer, this young man is my newspaper delivery person. I just subscribed yesterday and specifically requested delivery to my porch. Mrs. Park here saw him walking up to my door and immediately assumed he was up to no good." Officer Kim turned to Marcus. "Can I see some ID, please?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied calmly. He slowly reached into his bag and pulled out his Crystal Lake News ID badge, along with his school ID. "I've been delivering papers in this neighborhood for about a year now." Mrs. Park interrupted, her voice getting higher. "That doesn't prove anything. Anyone can fake an ID. I saw him going between houses. He was acting suspicious." "Ma'am," Officer Kim said patiently, "going between houses is what newspaper delivery people do. His ID checks out, and multiple neighbors have confirmed they know him." "Well, I've never seen him before," Mrs. Park insisted. "And in this neighborhood." "In this neighborhood what, Mrs. Park?" Ji-woo Kang called out from across the street, still recording everything on her phone. "Please, finish that sentence. We'd all like to hear exactly what you mean." Mrs. Park's face got even redder, but she didn't finish her thought. Instead, she changed tactics. "Well, how was I supposed to know? There have been break-ins in other neighborhoods. I'm just trying to protect our community." "By harassing a teenager doing his job?" Mr. Lee asked sharply. "By calling the police without even taking a moment to observe what he was actually doing." Officer Kim held up his hand for quiet. "Marcus, you can continue your route if you'd like. Everything checks out here." He turned to Mrs. Park. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that making false police reports is a serious offense. This young man was clearly performing his job, and multiple witnesses can confirm that." As Marcus carefully put his IDs away, he heard his phone buzz. Looking at the screen, he saw a text from his mother. "In car, coming." He took a deep breath, knowing things were about to get very interesting. The morning sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the neat lawns of Maple Street. Mrs. Park was still standing on her porch, though her phone was finally lowered. She was trying to explain to Officer Kim why her actions were justified, but her words were becoming less and less confident. More neighbors had gathered, many of them regular customers on Marcus's route. They were talking among themselves, sending disapproving looks in Mrs. Park's direction. Several had their phones out, recording everything. Marcus stood quietly, waiting. He knew his mother would handle this situation in her own way. As mayor of Crystal Lake, she had dealt with similar incidents before. But this time it was personal. This time it was her son who had been profiled and reported for simply doing his job. In the distance, he could hear the distinctive sound of a car turning onto Maple Street. He didn't need to look to know it was his mother's black SUV with the government plates. The scene was about to change dramatically, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a small smile forming on his face. Mrs. Park was still trying to defend her actions to Officer Kim, unaware that her morning was about to become much more complicated. "Officer, you have to understand, I was just trying to be vigilant. In these times, you can never be too careful." The black SUV pulled up to the curb. The black SUV's door opened, and Mayor Sophia Thompson stepped out. She was wearing a navy blue suit and carried herself with natural authority. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward the group. The morning sun caught the pin on her lapel, the official seal of Crystal Lake. Mrs. Park didn't notice the mayor's arrival at first. She was still trying to explain herself to Officer Kim. "You see, officer, when you live in a nice neighborhood like this, you have to be careful about who you let." "Let what, Mrs. Park?" Mayor Thompson's clear voice cut through the morning air. "Who you let walk down public streets, who you let do their job, who you let exist in spaces you think they don't belong in." Mrs. Park turned around. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. She looked from Marcus to Mayor Thompson, and back again, suddenly realizing the connection between them. Officer Kim straightened his posture. "Good morning, Mayor Thompson. I was just explaining to Mrs. Park that her complaint about your son was unfounded." "My son," Mayor Thompson repeated slowly, walking to stand beside Marcus. "My 15-year-old son, who has been delivering newspapers in this neighborhood for a year. My son, who maintains straight A's, runs track, and volunteers at the community center. That son." The neighbors who had gathered were completely silent now. Ji-Woo Kang was still recording, her phone capturing every moment of Mrs. Park's face as it went from red to pale. I didn't know," Mrs. Park stammered. "How was I supposed to know he was your son?" "That's exactly the point, Mrs. Park," Mayor Thompson said. Her voice was calm but firm. "You weren't supposed to need to know he was my son. You weren't supposed to need to know anything about him except what was right in front of your eyes, a teenager doing his job." Mr. Lee stepped forward. "Mayor Thompson, I want you to know that I just subscribed to the paper yesterday. Marcus was delivering my first copy when Mrs. Park started this whole situation." Mayor Thompson nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Lee. I appreciate you speaking up for my son." She turned back to Mrs. Park. "Would you like to explain to me why you felt it necessary to call the police? What exactly did you see that made you think a crime was being committed?" Mrs. Park clutched her phone tightly. I saw someone going between houses. There have been break-ins in other neighborhoods. At 7 in the morning, wearing a Crystal Lake News delivery bag, carefully placing newspapers on porches." Mayor Thompson listed each point clearly. "Or was there perhaps something else that made you suspicious?" Just then, a man hurried up the street. It was Ta-Won Park, Mrs. Park's husband, still wearing his hospital scrubs. He must have been called by one of the neighbors. "Sun-me, what's going on?" he asked, looking around at the crowd. When he saw Mayor Thompson, his eyes widened. "Madam Mayor, what are you doing here?" "Your wife called the police on my son, Dr. Park," Mayor Thompson explained. "She saw him delivering newspapers and decided he was suspicious." Dr. Park's face fell. He looked at his wife with disappointment. "Sun-me, is this true?" Mrs. Park started to speak, but her words came out jumbled. "I was just trying to. I didn't know. It's just that. I think what your wife is trying to say," Mayor Thompson said, "is that she saw a young black man in this neighborhood and automatically assumed he was doing something wrong. She didn't take even a moment to observe what he was actually doing. Instead, she decided to call the police, putting my son in potential danger." Dr. Park turned to Marcus. "I am so sorry," he said, bowing slightly. "This is completely unacceptable." He faced his wife. "Son, you need to apologize. Now." Mrs. Park looked around. Every face in the growing crowd was turned toward her. Ji Woo Kang was still recording. Officer Kim stood with his arms crossed. Mayor Thompson waited patiently, one hand on Marcus's shoulder. I'm sorry," Mrs. Park said quietly. "I shouldn't have assumed." "You shouldn't have assumed what?" Mayor Thompson pressed. "I shouldn't have assumed he was doing something wrong," Mrs. Park finished, looking at the ground. Mayor Thompson nodded. "No, you shouldn't have. But this isn't just about today, is it, Mrs. Park? The neighbors tell me you've appointed yourself the guardian of neighborhood standards. That you complain about everything from mailbox colors to garden arrangements. But somehow the first time you felt the need to call the police was when you saw my son." Several neighbors nodded in agreement. One called out, "She complained about my wind chimes 3 times. But she never called the police about them." Another added meaningfully. Dr. Park stepped forward. "Madam Mayor, I want you to know that this does not reflect our family's values. I work with people of all backgrounds at the hospital. We cannot have this kind of prejudice in our community." "I agree," Mayor Thompson said, "which is why this incident will not be ignored." She turned to address all the gathered neighbors. "Crystal Lake prides itself on being a welcoming community. We cannot allow prejudice and unfounded suspicion to poison our neighborhoods. What happened here today is a perfect example of the kind of bias that many people face every day." She looked at Mrs. Park directly. "As mayor, I could make this incident very difficult for you. I could press charges for filing a false police report. I could make sure everyone in Crystal Lake knows exactly what you did here today." Mrs. Park seemed to shrink under the mayor's gaze. But Mayor Thompson wasn't finished. "However, I believe in turning difficult moments into opportunities for growth. So instead, Mrs. Park, you're going to do something positive for this community." "What? What do you mean?" Mrs. Park asked nervously. "The community center where Marcus volunteers is starting a new program next month. It's called Breaking Barriers. It's designed to help people examine and overcome their prejudices. You're going to be one of our first participants." Dr. Park nodded firmly. "She will be there, Madam Mayor. I'll make sure of it." "Good," Mayor Thompson said. "And since you're so concerned about neighborhood standards, Mrs. Park, you can also volunteer with our Community Beautification Committee. They meet every Saturday morning, the same time Marcus does his paper route. You'll get to see firsthand how many different people work to make this neighborhood beautiful." Ji Woo Kang finally lowered her phone. "Madam Mayor, if it's okay with you, I'd like to share this video with the Breaking Barriers program. I think it could be a powerful teaching tool." Mayor Thompson considered this for a moment. "As long as faces are blurred and names aren't used, I think that would be valuable. Sometimes we need to see ourselves through others' eyes to understand the impact of our actions." She turned back to Mrs. Park. "This incident is over, but its lessons shouldn't be. I expect to see you at the community center next month. And Mrs. Park, the next time you see someone in this neighborhood you don't recognize, try saying good morning instead of calling the police." Marcus, who had been quiet throughout this exchange, finally spoke. "Mom, I should finish my route. There are still papers to deliver." Mayor Thompson smiled at her son. "Of course. Officer Kim, I trust there's no reason Marcus can't continue his work." "None at all, Madam Mayor," Officer Kim replied. "Though I'll need to file a report about the false emergency call." Dr. Park was leading his wife back toward their house. Mrs. Park looked shaken, her phone finally lowered, her earlier confidence completely gone. As they walked away, the neighbors could hear Dr. Park speaking quietly but firmly to his wife in Korean. The crowd began to disperse, but not before several neighbors came up to Marcus to express their support. Mr. Lee insisted on giving him a bottle of water and told him to take his time with the deliveries. Ji Woo Kang promised to send the video to both Marcus and the mayor. Mayor Thompson watched all this with a mixture of pride and sadness. When the last neighbor had gone back inside, she turned to her son. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Marcus nodded. I'm fine, Mom. I handled it just like you taught me. Yes, you did. She hugged him quickly. You kept your cool, stayed respectful, and didn't let anyone make you feel less than who you are. I'm proud of you, but I'm sorry you had to experience this at all. At least something good might come from it, Marcus said, adjusting his delivery bag. Maybe Mrs. Park will learn something from those breaking barriers sessions. Mayor Thompson smiled. That's my boy. Always looking for the positive. Now finish your route. We'll talk more at home. As Marcus walked away to deliver the rest of his papers, Mayor Thompson watched him for a moment. Then she turned to Officer Kim. Make sure that report is thorough, officer. We need to document these incidents properly if we're ever going to change things. Yes, Madam Mayor, Officer Kim replied. And for what it's worth, your son handled himself better than many adults would have in that situation. He shouldn't have had to, Mayor Thompson said quietly. Then she straightened her shoulders and headed back to her SUV. She had a city to run, and now she had a new program to strengthen. Crystal Lake was a good community, but even good communities needed constant work to become better. Behind her, Marcus continued his paper route, his head held high, doing his job just as he had every weekend for the past year. The morning sun was fully up now, casting no shadows, illuminating everything clearly for all to see. 1 month had passed since the incident on Maple Street. The story had spread throughout Crystal Lake, though not in the way Mrs. Park had feared. Instead of becoming a source of neighborhood gossip, it had turned into a catalyst for change. The community center was buzzing with activity on a warm Saturday morning. The first session of the Breaking Barriers program was about to begin. Mayor Thompson stood at the front of the room, watching as people filed in. There were familiar faces from Maple Street, including Jia Wu Kang and Mr. Lee, who had volunteered to help run the program. Mrs. Park sat in the back row, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her husband, Dr. Park, sat beside her, having taken the morning off from the hospital to attend. Over the past month, they had many long conversations about prejudice and assumptions. Dr. Park had shared stories from his work at the hospital, stories about patients who faced discrimination daily. Welcome, everyone, Mayor Thompson began. Today marks the start of something important for our community. We're here because we recognize that even good neighborhoods can become better, and that starts with understanding each other. She gestured to the screen behind her, where Jai Wu's video from the incident played silently, faces blurred, but the situation clear. Mrs. Park sank lower in her seat, but Mayor Thompson wasn't trying to shame her. This video shows us something that happens too often in too many places, the mayor continued. But what makes Crystal Lake special is how we choose to respond. Instead of letting this incident divide us, we're using it to bring us together. Marcus, who had finished his paper route early to attend, sat in the front row. He had helped design some of the program activities, drawing from his own experiences. When his mother nodded to him, he stood up and walked to the front. Hi, everyone, he said confidently. Today we're going to start with a simple exercise. We're going to share stories about times when someone surprised us by being different from what we expected. These can be good surprises or challenging ones. In the back of the room, Mrs. Park listened as others shared their stories. A young man talked about assuming an elderly woman wouldn't understand his computer problem, only to learn she was a retired software engineer. A teenager described how she thought her math teacher would be mean because he looked stern, but he turned out to be the kindest teacher she'd ever had. Finally, Mrs. Park raised her hand. Her voice was quiet but clear. I want to share my story, she said. I want to talk about the day I learned that assumptions can hurt not just others, but also ourselves. The room grew silent. This was the first time Mrs. Park had spoken publicly about what had happened. Mayor Thompson nodded encouragingly. I thought I was protecting my neighborhood, Mrs. Park continued. But really, I was letting fear and prejudice make decisions for me. I didn't see a hard-working student doing his job. I only saw what I was afraid of seeing. She looked directly at Marcus. I've spent the last month thinking about that morning, about how differently things could have gone, about how my actions could have had serious consequences for someone who was doing nothing wrong. Dr. Park squeezed his wife's hand as she continued. The hardest part was admitting to myself that I acted on prejudices I didn't even know I had. I thought because my husband and I came from another country, because we had faced discrimination ourselves, we couldn't be prejudiced. But that morning showed me how wrong I was. After the session, people gathered in small groups to talk. Mrs. Park approached Marcus and his mother. "I've been wanting to tell you both something," she said. "My grandmother used to deliver newspapers in Korea when she was young. She did it to help pay for my father's schooling. When I realized I had called the police on someone doing the same honest work my grandmother did." She paused, wiping her eyes. "I've never felt so ashamed." Mayor Thompson touched Mrs. Park's shoulder gently. "Shame can either paralyze us or motivate us to do better. You're choosing to do better. That matters." Marcus nodded. "You know, Mrs. Park, something good did come from that morning. Look around this room. All these people are here because they want to learn and change." The community center had indeed become busier since the program started. Young Ho Lee had organized a cultural exchange program where neighbors could share their stories and traditions. Ji Woo Kang started a youth mentoring program, matching teenagers with successful professionals from different backgrounds. Even Mrs. Park had found a way to channel her energy positively. She still cared about neighborhood standards, but now she focused on bringing people together rather than finding fault. She had started organizing monthly community dinners where neighbors could share their cultural dishes and stories. After the session, Marcus headed out for his regular volunteer work at the center. As he walked through the parking lot, he saw Dr. Park helping his wife into their car. Mrs. Park caught his eye and gave a small wave. Marcus waved back, remembering what his mother always said: "Change happens one person at a time, one day at a time." Later that afternoon, Mayor Thompson sat in her office, reviewing the day's events. On her desk was a proposal for expanding the Breaking Barriers program to other neighborhoods. Next to it was a letter from the state governor, expressing interest in implementing similar programs across the state. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Mom, you won't believe what happened at the center today. 3 more neighborhoods want to start their own Breaking Barriers programs." She smiled, thinking about how a moment of conflict had transformed into an opportunity for growth. Crystal Lake was changing, not through force or shame, but through understanding and connection. The next morning, as Marcus did his paper route, things were different on Maple Street. Mrs. Park was outside early, working in her garden. When she saw Marcus, she stood up and walked to her mailbox. "Good morning, Marcus," she called out. "Would you like some water? It's going to be hot today." "Thanks, Mrs. Park," he replied, accepting the bottle she held out. "The roses are looking beautiful." "They are, aren't they?" she said, looking at her garden. "I'm thinking of entering them in the community garden show next month. Will you be there?" "Of course," Marcus said. "Mom and I never miss it. Maybe you could teach me about roses sometime. I've been wanting to start a garden at the community center." Mrs. Park's face lit up. "I'd like that," she said. "Perhaps we could make it a project for the youth program. There's so much to learn from watching things grow." As Marcus continued his route, he thought about how much had changed in just 1 month. The neighborhood felt different now, more open, more connected. Even Mrs. Park's garden seemed different, with new flowers adding splashes of color among her precious roses. At the next house, Mr. Lee was already outside, wearing his gardening hat. "Marcus," he called out, "don't forget about the community dinner tonight. My wife's making her famous bulgogi." "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied, delivering the paper. "Mom's bringing her sweet potato pie." The morning sun rose higher, warming the peaceful streets of Crystal Lake. The neighborhood was still known for its beautiful houses and perfect lawns, but now it was known for something else too: its ability to learn, to change, and to grow stronger through understanding. 6 months had passed since that morning on Maple Street. Crystal Lake had changed in ways that surprised everyone. including Mayor Thompson. The Breaking Barriers program had spread to 15 other neighborhoods, and 3 nearby cities had started their own versions of it. On a crisp autumn morning, Marcus walked his paper route as golden leaves fell around him. He now had company on his rounds. Several younger kids from the neighborhood had started their own routes, and he had become their mentor. Among them was Min Park, Mrs. Park's 12-year-old nephew, who was visiting for the school year. "Marcus, how do you fold the paper so perfectly?" Min asked, struggling with his own stack of newspapers. He had been in Crystal Lake for 2 months, living with his aunt and uncle while his parents worked overseas. "Here, let me show you," Marcus said, demonstrating the technique he had perfected over the past year and a half. "The trick is to make the first fold tight, then tuck in the edges." As they walked down Maple Street, Mrs. Park was already outside, setting up for the neighborhood's monthly community breakfast. The event had become a tradition, rotating between different houses each month. Today was her turn to host. "Good morning, boys," she called out cheerfully. "Min, are you learning a lot from Marcus?" "Yes, Aunt Sunmay," Min replied. "He's teaching me all his tricks." Mrs. Park smiled at Marcus. "We're so lucky to have such a good mentor for Min. Will you and your mother be joining us for breakfast after your route?" "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus said. "Mom's coming straight from her morning meeting. The governor is very interested in how Crystal Lake has changed." The front yards of Maple Street looked different now. Where once there had been only perfectly trimmed lawns, there were now community garden boxes growing vegetables and flowers. The project had started at the community center and spread throughout the neighborhood. Even Mrs. Park had converted half of her prized rose garden into a vegetable patch. As Marcus and Min continued their deliveries, they passed Mr. Lee's house. The elderly man was setting up chairs in his driveway for the breakfast. His garage had been transformed into a community library and meeting space, where neighbors often gathered to share books and stories. "Marcus," Mr. Lee called out, "don't forget about the youth leadership meeting this afternoon. We're planning the Winter Festival." The Winter Festival was a new addition to Crystal Lake's calendar. It had been Mrs. Park's idea, surprisingly enough. She had wanted to create an event where everyone could share their winter traditions and celebrations. At the end of the route, Marcus and Min stopped at the community center to drop off some extra newspapers. The building had been renovated and expanded, thanks to funding that came after the success of the Breaking Barriers program. The walls were covered with photographs showing the neighborhood's transformation over the past 6 months. Inside, they found Mayor Thompson in an early morning meeting with community leaders from other cities. Through the glass doors, they could see her pointing to charts and graphs, showing the positive changes that had come to Crystal Lake. "Is that really all because of what happened with my aunt?" Min asked quietly. Marcus thought carefully before answering. "What happened that day showed us something important," he explained. "It showed us that when something bad happens, we have 2 choices. We can let it make us angry and bitter, or we can use it to make things better." They walked back to Maple Street, where the community breakfast was now in full swing. Tables lined the street, filled with dishes from different cultures. Mrs. Park was arranging a plate of Korean pancakes next to Dr. Park's hospital colleague's soul food dishes. Jae-woo Kang was there with her camera, as usual. She had started documenting the neighborhood's transformation, and her short film about Crystal Lake had won an award at a local film festival. "Marcus, Min," she called out, "come see the final edit of the documentary." The documentary was playing on a laptop at one of the tables. It showed clips from that fateful morning 6 months ago, then moved through the changes that had followed. There was footage of the first Breaking Barriers session, the start of the community garden project, and dozens of small moments of neighbors helping neighbors. Mayor Thompson arrived just as the documentary was ending. She watched the final scenes with tears in her eyes. Scenes of Mrs. Park teaching Korean cooking classes at the community center, of Marcus helping Min learn his paper route, of Dr. Park giving free health screenings at the community festival. Sometimes, Mayor Thompson said to the gathered neighbors, "The best things come from the hardest moments. 6 months ago, we could have let one incident divide us. Instead, we chose to let it unite us. Mrs. Park stood up, her hands clasped in front of her. "I need to say something," she announced. The crowd grew quiet. 6 months ago, I was the problem. I let fear and prejudice control my actions. But this community, all of you, showed me a better way. You didn't just forgive me. You helped me learn and grow." She turned to Marcus and his mother. "Mayor Thompson, Marcus, you could have responded to my actions with anger. Nobody would have blamed you. Instead, you showed me kindness and gave me a chance to change. You helped me become a better person." Marcus smiled, remembering how different things had been 6 months ago. Now, Mrs. Park was one of the most active volunteers at the community center. She had even started a program helping new immigrants adjust to life in Crystal Lake. "The thing is," Marcus said, addressing the crowd, "change isn't just about big moments. It's about all the small moments that come after. It's about choosing, every day, to see people as they really are, not as we assume they are." Mayor Thompson put her arm around her son's shoulders, proud of the young man he had become. The incident that could have been a source of trauma had instead become a source of strength, not just for Marcus, but for the entire community. As the breakfast continued, more neighbors arrived. The tables were filled with laughter and conversation in multiple languages. Children played together on lawns that no longer had keep-off signs. Older residents shared stories with younger ones, passing down history and wisdom. Men turned to Marcus as they helped serve coffee to the seniors. "You know what's funny?" he said. "My parents were worried about sending me to stay with Aunt Sunday. They had heard she was kind of strict, but she's different now. She's the one who suggested I learn the paper route from you." Marcus nodded. "People can surprise you," he said. "Sometimes they just need a chance to show their better side." As the morning went on, Mayor Thompson received a call from the governor's office. The state wanted to use Crystal Lake's story as a model for community transformation. Mrs. Park overheard the conversation and smiled, remembering how she had once thought she was protecting the neighborhood standards. Now she understood that the highest standard any community could have was how it treated all its members. The autumn sun rose higher over Maple Street, warming the gathered neighbors. Where there had once been suspicion and division, there was now connection and understanding. The perfectly manicured lawns had given way to community gardens, the silent mornings to friendly greetings, the closed doors to open hearts. And it had all started with a newspaper delivery on an ordinary morning 6 months ago.